Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 18th annual Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture. My name is Joan Brzezinski, and I direct the China Center here at the University of Minnesota. I'm happy to welcome you here today for what will be a very timely discussion on technology tensions in the U.S.-China relationship. In 2019, the China Center celebrates 40 years of building bridges between Minnesota, the university, and China. From 1979, Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening, to Xi's national rejuvenation, the China Center has strived to build bridges of exchange and understanding and facilitate the discussion of the many concerns and challenges of this historic and important relationship. In the recent months, the work of building bridges seems to be a bit more challenging, or interesting, as we might say in Minnesota. From the trade tariffs and their impact on U.S.-China business, to the Confucius Institute, the American Cultural Center, models of cultural exchange, to intellectual property protection and high-tech espionage, to the 1,000 Talents programs and visa restrictions. There is little agreement and outright hostilities. Is it possible to review and scrutinize this complex relationship and produce new engagements that benefit both China and the U.S.? What are our strategic and long-term implications? How do we resolve the tensions that are building as we build these new bridges of exchange? The annual Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture provides us the space to explore the issues, inform our perspectives, and shape the dialogue. I thank Bob and Kim for their vision, their support for this lecture. Your generosity inspires us to engage in a shared discovery of meaningful discussion about the U.S.-China relationship and its future. We believe people's lives are enriched through global connections and understanding. At this time, allow me to introduce Chang Wang. He is a senior partner and attorney at Kingsville Law and at University of Minnesota School of Law alumnus, a China Center Advisory Council member. He specializes in immigration and corporate law. He will introduce our speaker, Mr. Guo, and serve as our host this evening. As a quick housekeeping reminder, we accept all of our questions on these cards. Please write your questions. If you have one, just hold it up, and we'll collect them for the Q&A that follows the lecture immediately. So everyone, please help me welcome to the stage here, Mr. Chang Wang.
Thank you, June, and thank you, Kaiser. Good afternoon. It is both an honor and a daunting task to occupy this platform for a few moments before Kaiser. When June asked me to give a few remarks on Kaiser and his lecture, she did not know that I am a fan of Kaiser's music and a loyal listener to his podcast. From Tang Dynasty to Chunqiu, Kaiser became a cultural icon in China. Rock and rollers were the cultural heroes of the 90s, just like authors were the cultural heroes of the 80s. I went to college in Beijing in the 90s, when Tang Dynasty, Tang Chao, Black Panther, Hei Bao, and Cui Jian offered a cathartic experience from the suffocating political environment. Hearing his music, reading his column, and listening to his podcast, the more we know Kaiser, the more we realize that underneath Kaiser's adventurous surface, he has an elegant spirit, a razor-sharp sense of instinct and boundless curiosity, and most importantly, a big heart. From Beijinger to Seneca, Kaiser shared his encyclopedic knowledge and genuine love of China and the Chinese. He has an awesome ability to illuminate the most complex of concepts to a colleague, to an audience, to the man in the street. His comments on China and the U.S.-China relations are based on his deep understanding of both countries and both cultures. His comments are sometimes deceptively simple, but always exquisitely profound. Kaiser is a lineal descendant of the Chinese intellectual traditions of the literati, scholar, gentleman, Shi Dafu, and the knight-errant, You Xia, and it would not be too difficult to identify which part of a Kaiser belonged to the literati tradition and which part of him belonged to the knight-errant tradition. Kaiser has multiple identities. He's a musician, an author, a commentator, a correspondent, a podcast host, a business executive. He's too talented to be defined or to be categorized. Asian Americans, like Kaiser, are sometimes viewed as forever outsiders of both universes. But indeed, Asian Americans are insiders in both worlds. Kaiser can think like Chinese in deciphering the often vague and confusing messages from the Chinese authority. At the same time, he's a zealous advocate of equal protection and due process. As a true American patriot who has unwavering confidence in our system of the rule of law and fundamental fairness. Kaiser is an American who speaks fluent Chinese, dreams in Chinese, and probably curses in Chinese. He's a Chinese who speaks perfect English and dreams in English. He is no less American than any other American, and he is no less Chinese than any other Chinese. And because of this, we need to listen to him. We need to listen to Kaiser to understand the technology tensions in US-China relations, as the US and China engage in a high-stakes negotiation over the future of their trade relationship. Its technology is at the heart of the debate. Since the beginning of 2017, the US government has charged at least 3 people with spying for China, or attempting or conspiring to do so, and prosecuted at least 5 other cases, where the alleged intellectual property theft or attempted theft were for the benefit of the Chinese government. In November 2018, then Attorney Jeff Sessions created a China initiative to aggressively identify and prosecute economic espionage cases related to China. Sessions threatened that China must decide whether it wants to be a trusted partner on the world stage or whether it wants to be known around the world as a dishonest regime running on corrupt economic founded on fraud, theft, and strong-arm tactics. In January 2019, the Department of Justice unsealed a series of indictments against Huawei, the Chinese telecom company at the center of the escalating clash between US and China over technology. US federal prosecutors accused Huawei's employees and executives of repeatedly lying to the US government officials and business partners from the Chinese company's benefit to pay employees to steal trade secrets from the United States. Huawei denied acquisitions, and Beijing has detained a series of foreign citizens in recent months on suspicion of endangering Chinese national security in what some analysts view as a retaliatory measure. Chinese officials have denied any links. Opening your morning paper, you see headlines like the Huawei indictment marks the end of US-China cycle of trust. Is Made in China 2025 a threat to global trade? China is leading the artificial intelligence, and American business should take note. China drives international patent application to record highs. Why 5G, a battleground for US and China, is also a military conflict. In AI superpower, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Power, the book authored by Kai-Fu Lee, you'll hear Lee's startling argument. If data is the new oil, then China is the new Saudi Arabia. Then you hear David Brooks praising Marco Rubio's report on Made in China 2025 and the future of American industry. It's becoming increasingly clear that China is a grave economic, technological, and intellectual threat to the United States and the world order. What are all these about? What is going on, and where are we going? Now, without further ado, please, we need to listen to Kaiser to understand what all this is about, to better understand China, and to better understand ourselves. Thank you very much.
Okay, I can't possibly live up to that billing now, but if you would put those verbs all in past tense and come to my funeral and read that as a eulogy instead, I think that would work just fine. It's a deal. I'm incredibly honored to be invited here this afternoon, and I want to say a bunch of thank yous first to Joan and to Anne, first of all, for making me just feel so welcome here in just the very short time that I've been here already, and especially, of course, to Bob and to Kim Griffin, whose spectacular work over the years in building these bridges of understanding between China and the United States, these two countries that I love so deeply. It really means a lot to me. I had an opportunity to chat with you both just before, and I'm just very moved and very impressed. I wish I could have arrived here in happier times, though, under circumstances that aren't quite as trying as the ones that we are now in. For people like me and like my gracious hosts who care as much as I do about the state of bilateral relations between China and the United States, I think it can't be repeated enough for the rest of you either. It's just the most important bilateral relationship in the world and will be for the rest of our lives. We've heard it a million times, but it just keeps on bearing repeating. Unless you have been living, though, under a rock or, in the Minnesotan case, buried beneath a snowdrift, you will be aware, you are doubtless aware, that the technology issues that bedevil the relationship have really moved very much to the heart, to the very center of the tensions between the U.S. and China. The current controversy that Chung mentioned over Chinese telecommunications equipment giant Huawei is only the most visible piece of it right now. But if you think about it, just about everything, all the problems that beset this relationship right now, all kind of either boil down to technology or have a very strong technology dimension to them. Our bilateral trade issues are not, I regret to inform you, actually about the tchotchkes and the gewgaws that you can buy on the shelves at Walmart. They are not, in fact, about surplus steel, about aluminum or anything like that. Not about commodities. They're not, in fact, about soybeans. They are instead about technology. Look at the U.S. Trade Representative's 301 report, which really set all this stuff in motion and really has sort of defined the parameters of what the current trade war is really all about. It's about China's industrial policy, about Made in China 2025, which the Americans allege unfairly advantages Chinese tech companies, and it's about China's aim to dominate the technologies that will define our industrial might, the industrial might of nations in the coming decades. It's about industrial espionage. It's about forced technology transfer. And when you think about it, it's about much more than just trade, more than about even American global competitiveness. There is a strong values dimension to it as well. It's about our concerns and our anxieties about what purposes Chinese technology will be put to. If you follow the news about China, as I'm sure many of you do here in this audience, you will have noticed an appreciable uptick in the number of stories that focus on the ways that Beijing is harnessing these advanced technologies for coercive or repressive purposes. You'll have read stories about facial recognition, which isn't just used in legitimate law enforcement, but is used actually, for example, in these terrible camps that have been built in northwestern China's Xinjiang Autonomous Region. You'll have read about the use of biometrics, about DNA collection. You'll have read about the way facial recognition is used to dispense toilet paper at public restrooms so that people don't take too much of it because that's such a horrible crime. But no, really, we now routinely read these dire warnings from our punditry, who believe that the tech-enabled surveillance regime that I talked about in Xinjiang is going to be, well, that's just really just kind of a dry run or a trial run for the rollout of these technologies across China. We even fear that they're going to be, exported abroad. In the last year especially, we've read a great many stories about China's so-called social credit system. These newspaper outlets that have written about it, unfortunately, have not done a particularly good job. They've been quite irresponsible and misleading in a number of important ways. But the way they have written about it really does seem to confirm our worst fears about the Orwellian purposes behind China's push for global technology leadership. And there have been numerous stories in the news about Chinese foul play on the field of technological competition. Some of the reporting, as far as I can tell, seems to have some real basis, in fact. The Marriott hacks, for example. The Marriott hotels lost millions of names in their database. Some decidedly are less well-founded, like that story that some of you might have read in Bloomberg, which told how some Chinese company had managed to secretly implant a grain of rice-sized microprocessor on all the printed circuit boards that went into Amazon and Apple internet data centers. That story has been almost thoroughly debunked, and yet Bloomberg has yet to come out and actually disavow it. We now often read about China's rising technological prowess in things like artificial intelligence, right? In advanced robotics, in gene editing technologies, in quantum computing, and even in some, generic, consumer technologies. If you pay attention to what's being written about this stuff in China's tech-powered military advantages, you'll have read about shipborne rail guns, which are a very frightful new weapon that can catapult very, very heavy projectiles at much faster speeds than traditional explosives-powered weapons. You'll have read about hypersonic missiles that can defeat our most advanced missile defense forces. You'll have read about the carrier killer, I think it's the DF-25 missile that can supposedly take out an aircraft carrier. Concern over China's growing capabilities and technology also lurks behind our recent obsession, which I think is a very unfortunate one, with influence operations, and lies behind what to me are very disturbing moves in the House and in the Senate to try to restrict visas to Chinese graduate students, especially in the STEM fields, as well as really to other researchers. I mean, it's people who look like us who are now falling under the suspicious eye of some of our national security forces. Now, think about this. Here in the US, though, our narratives about Chinese technology have really shifted. They haven't just shifted, they've completely flipped on their heads. They've swung utterly wildly. And this hasn't just happened, this happened very recently, and it happened very abruptly. The fact that these things have swung so far should, I think, raise some real red flags for us, both about what we thought then, the old narratives, and what we're thinking now. Let's talk about what some of these narratives are and about how they have flipped. Not so very long ago, there was sort of this optimistic consensus that the arrival of the internet, and some years later, especially the advent of social media in China and in other authoritarian regimes, would create an irrepressible surge in the ability of individuals to express political opinions. Bill Clinton, in his folksy and pithy way, said, "You can't nail the jello to the wall." He visited China in 1999 and said that about the futility, ultimately, of Chinese internet censorship. China, of course, has since invented the world's most advanced jello nailing technologies. Now, to be clear, I am an advocate of engagement, but I nonetheless recognize that this belief in the liberating power of technology was really part and parcel of that same over-optimistic belief held by many, certainly by not all people, about what engagement would do, that engagement would somehow produce meaningful political change in China. The internet seemed to so many people like the ultimate tool of engagement. It was really the thing that was supposed to pry open those closed doors. That sense of techno-optimism, the belief in the power of what I've been calling liberation technology, endured really up through the Arab Spring. And I think at the very least, recall how our pundits had this way of appending the name of some American social media property to every later color revolution event or to the Arab Spring events or to things that were precursors to the Arab Spring. For example, Moldova was the first of a couple of different Twitter revolutions. When Ahmadinejad was reelected and the streets of Tehran broke out in protest, we called that the YouTube revolution. Tahrir Square in Egypt was called the Facebook revolution. We have this habit of doing that, and believe me, China is taking notes like, okay, Facebook, how do you spell it? Got it. blocked, right? You've got to realize that. I mean, but in China, things did not turn out obviously the way that the techno-utopians had expected. Of course, if you look at the present understanding of the relationship in China between advancing technology and level of political liberty, it's clear that the prevailing belief among Americans and other Westerners too is that China's technology actually enables repression. Technology is not the bane of authoritarianism. It's its handmaiden now in the way that we imagine the world to be. In fact, we are so worried about the illiberal potential of China's technology that we now, as I suggested, we fret about its spread beyond China's borders. We worry that there are other illiberal states in the world who are learning these methods, these technologies of coercion and repression, of censorship, directly from China. China, as some have darkly joked, wants to make the world safe for autocracy, right? There is another important way in which I think our narratives about Chinese technology have completely flipped, right? I worked in the tech sector in China and reported on it as a journalist for much of my time there, really from the time I stopped, I quit this band in 1999 and promptly became a guy working for an internet company. There was a lot of venture capital money washing around. It was easy. But from there, I went on to become a technology journalist, and I got to see this firsthand. And we always used to, it was just sort of a matter of course. We all recognized that there were a lot of Chinese internet companies that were basically just clones of American companies. In fact, we talked about the C2C business model, which in the United States stood for consumer to consumer, as in China standing for copy to China. That's C2C. But this idea of Chinese companies being mostly incapable of innovation really endured for quite some time, even though it was already patently not true, until really just a couple of years ago. Think about this. Do you remember in 2015 when Vice President Joe Biden was going around and making graduation speeches? This is a major talking point for him. He talked about how because we are free, we will forever preserve our innovative edge over China. He wasn't the only one doing that in that same time period. On the other side of the aisle, we had Carly Fiorina, who really ought to have known better because she was, after all, the CEO of HP and had a foot in the world of technology. But she was going around challenging her audiences to name one thing that China had innovated. I guess nobody in any of her rallies had WeChat installed on their phone. They couldn't have shown her at the time. That's too bad. But now suddenly, weirdly, and beginning maybe in 2016 or 2017, the narrative flipped. Suddenly we're afraid China is going to eat our lunch. Suddenly China is going to out-innovate us. It's outpaced us in all these things. It's surged forward. It's this unstoppable technology juggernaut that's just going to roll us over and then maybe stop and pick up our lunch and eat it. But for my part, I would have welcomed a correction from our underestimation of China's technological innovative capacity back then. I would have welcomed that. But it's as wrong now in our overestimation of it as we were wrong back then in our underestimation of it. And we just can't seem to come to a reasonable assessment of it. Instead we are freaking out. At least in Washington, D.C., they're certainly freaking out. In a lot of other places, not here in Minneapolis, where Minnesotans are constitutionally incapable of freaking out in any way, which is one of the wonderful things about you, but certainly in D.C. We are as wrong, I said, in our overestimation as we today as we were in our underestimation then. China's weaknesses in core technologies have been on conspicuous display. Think about ZTE, this company that President Trump nearly shut down and then spared. They were on their knees because they lacked core processor technology they could not import from the United States. There are still the companies that make the gold standard of photolithography machines. These are not the etch 7 nanometer, which is really the gold standard. They are not something that China can produce or will be able to produce for some time. There are many areas in which the United States still has a comfortable lead. We're as wrong also in our overestimation back then of technology's capability at transforming, at liberalizing the oppressed from authoritarianism's grip, as we are now wrong in our certainty that it's going to create the kind of totalitarian horrors, those Orwellian societies that we so fear. And these things, you have to wonder, are they linked? Are these two narrative flips actually related in some way? Well, yes, I actually think that they are. They both represent a change in the way that we see the relationship between technology and politics. A good bit of this, I am convinced, is on us, has to do with us, is our experience in recent years. I suppose one would include, for example, the failure of so many of the Arab Spring, really all of the Arab Spring uprisings. The one that we thought was kind of a success, Tunisia, was actually exporting more ISIS fighters per capita than any other country in the Arab Middle East. Are these, I think we also have to look at the Snowden revelations. We discovered that the NSA was actually harnessing our own technology companies to spy on American citizens. But I think that the real thing that changed everything was the revelations of the sinister ways in which Facebook was used by companies like Cambridge Analytica, which you're all familiar with, and also, of course, by nefarious agents of the Russians who were actually meddling directly in our democratic processes, using our social media to pit us against one another, to sow discord and hate. Our extreme pendulum swings, though, when it comes to our understanding of technology in China, our flip-outs, our lack of measured perspective, they issue, though, more profoundly from some serious cognitive dissonance that China has produced in the American psyche. China, after all, has this habit of challenging certain core American assumptions, things that have become axiomatic to our beliefs about the way the world works. First, it challenged our belief that a free market economy is somehow inseparable from political democracy. You weren't supposed to have the fruits of these free enterprise without the commensurate political freedoms, right? Multi-party democracy is what we were supposed to have. The marketplace of ideas was supposed to be indispensable to successful capital markets, to successful labor markets, and to successful supermarkets, right? And somehow, I mean, I think by the early 2000s, China had somehow disabused us of this idea, but it's never sat comfortably with us. Somebody who I hold in great respect, the former Ambassador Chaz W. Freeman Jr., told me once, he said, it's a bit like that idea that the bumblebee can't fly. The physics says the anatomy of the bumblebee is such that it should not be able to fly, and yet the bumblebee flies. If that weren't enough, China then went on to challenge another core assumption, one that I think has become one of the sturdier bastions of our own American exceptionalism. That is the idea that we are uniquely innovative because, as Joe Biden was saying back then, that we are a free and open society. This isn't just saying that freedom is a necessary condition to innovation. It's actually saying, going beyond that, it's more hubristic than that. It's saying freedom is a sufficient condition for innovation, which is a very disturbing idea and one that I think we should perish soon. It's irrespective of how you feel about China's rise. Now China has demonstrated quite to the contrary of the belief. I mean, you could have genuine technology innovation even under a system of rigid information controls and heavy-handed censorship. But I don't think it took China to, I mean, anyone who maybe thought, gosh, where was the V2 rocket invented? Or, gosh, who put the first artificial satellite into space, the first dog, the first man into space, right? Soviet Russia was obviously not exactly a paragon of liberal democracy in that part. In any case, as a bonus, though, it has also assailed a challenge has challenged this American faith in our bootstrap mythology, in the bottom up that we have always believed in. Top down was never supposed to work. Industrial policy directed from the technocrats was not supposed to work. Instead, we believed in, from the time of Thomas Alva Edison, about that scrappy entrepreneur, that inventor tinkering away in his garage. From Edison to Steve Jobs and beyond, we've still believed in that. but we're now really having a great deal of difficulty swallowing this. And this is, the anxiety we're experiencing about Made in China 2025. So there's really something about China's rise as a tech powerhouse that just sticks in the American craw. Not that China doesn't bring a lot of baggage to this either. In fact, I would say both nations really do contribute to this complex tangle. On both sides, there are quite legitimate national security concerns. Absolutely. These blend, however, with considerations about, basic economic competitiveness. They blend also with a good dose of ideology mixed in, with some naked protectionist impulses. On the ideology, it's things like nationalism that I'm talking about. These are irrational or emotional urges that get wrapped up into the way that both sides think about this technology competition that we're now in. It's further complicated by the way that our country is experiencing what we must admit is an uncomfortable psychological moment. This moment when a country so accustomed to hegemony, 70 years of basically unchallenged global hegemony. We had the Soviet Union, but they were not, like China is today, a multi-dimensional peer that's truly challenging us on more than just a national defense front, or more than just, say, Japan did in the 80s on an economic front. This is a multi-dimensional peer, the first one we faced. And we don't feel comfortable about needing to move over on the couch and make a little bit of room. That's totally understandable. I think it makes a lot of sense. Just to make this, what is already quite a tangled mess, even more complicated, both countries have the political exigencies of domestic politics. They both have domestic audiences that they need to consider in their policymaking, and that really complicates things. So we cannot tonight pull on all of these threads. So I want to focus instead on technology, rightly, I think, this is one of the most conspicuous threads in this tangled skein that we're talking about. A time like this calls for, I think, really clear-eyed and sober thinking. Unfortunately, my distinct sense is there's a lot more heat being brought to this conversation, especially in Washington, D.C., than there is light being brought to it. So I hope that maybe this afternoon we can bring a little bit of light here and illuminate some of the underlying issues. Let me make sure one thing. I am not suggesting that we are wrong to be concerned over Chinese capabilities and technology, because there is no doubt that Chinese are going to continue to put technology to uses that are quite antithetical to our values and counter to many of our interests. China will doubtlessly continue to harness new technologies and data capabilities developed by its private sector to enhance China's own military capabilities. They will do that, like it or not. To be clear, I don't like it. We have entered a time when discussions about China in the United States, and especially about Chinese technology, are no longer dominated by conversations about the potentials of cooperation, but rather about national security, and this is not likely to change anytime soon. I worry, though, that we are already pursuing policies that are intended to hobble or to inhibit China, but that perversely will do real harm to America. And that's what I'm really here to argue. These policies will effectively marginalize Western companies and Western investors, shut them out of the still massive growth opportunities that we are still going to see in China in many fields of technology. We should remember, I think it does us really well to remember the extent to which Western firms were intimately involved in the rise of China's technology in the 1990s and the 2000s. And Bob, you were a part of this. And I think you probably know this as well as anyone. I mean, look at the Chinese internet companies, for example, the most prominent ones. So many Chinese technology companies were founded by people who were themselves either returnees who had studied in the United States, some of them actually green card holders, occasionally people who were actually naturalized citizens. Where did they go for their operating capital? They went to Sand Hill Road, American Venture Capital. Those are the ones who funded it. And where did they go for their when they wanted to tap capital markets? They all, with some exceptions, they all listed on the New York Stock Exchange, or especially on NASDAQ. They had a lot of American DNA in them, and that was a good thing. It was a period of deep cross-pollination where so many best practices were shared, where so much governance, so much wisdom in governance was passed from one side to the other. And really, I'm talking about in one dimension, in one direction. It was a period when there was so much transfer of soft skills for some uniformity in standards, where interoperability was really something that people worried about, that people cared about. There were so many intangible good things that came out of that contact, that proximity between the tech ecosystems of China and the United States. So there are more profound ways in which a new digital Iron Curtain will harm us as a society than I can even begin to enumerate. I'll discuss some of these later in the talk, but what should be clear in this time of mounting anxieties is that all of us have to come to a more realistic assessment of what China's actual tech capabilities are. What makes Chinese tech tick? We need to understand that much better than we do, because right now I don't think most of us do. It's true whether we're looking to invest in China, whether we are looking to tap China's markets in some way, its consumer markets, whether we are looking to compete with Chinese technologies, whether we want to formulate technology policy toward China, or whether we want to reckon with China's technology-enhanced strategic capabilities in national defense. To arrive at any such understanding, we need to get into the heads of the Chinese party state. We need to understand how they see their role in fostering the development of technology. We should also, just as importantly, get into the heads of ordinary tech workers, people who are entrepreneurs, who are innovators. We need to get into the heads also of tech consumers in China. We need to understand their relationship to technology, because I assure you it is very different. I know this from my 20 years there working in and around technology. It's very, very different than what we have here. There are social and cultural factors. These are habits of mind, attitudes, beliefs, whatever you want to call them, that have given a substantial lift, I would argue, to China's development of a tech ecosystem. They are going to pose significant challenges to us as they develop into values, as they develop into priorities and behaviors which are not consonant with our own values, our own behaviors, our own norms. I have not seen these ideas articulated particularly well, let alone systematically studied. So take what I say here with a grain of salt, because I'm kind of spitballing, but I do think it's important to try and spell out what some of these cultural and historical factors are. I would start with this one simple observation. Very few Chinese people exhibit the same kind of unease over technology that has become so commonplace here in the West. And that shouldn't be surprising. In China, since reform and opening began, or at least for the last 30, if not 40 years, the correlation across time between bettered lives and the spread and improvement of technology is remarkably solid. It has happened in near perfect lockstep by all impressions. The better my device I'm carrying around, the better I'm earning, the more leisure I have, the more countries I can travel to. The improvement, it has never gone the other direction. So there's every reason for an ordinary Chinese person, anyone 50 years older or younger, to never remember a time when this was not so. There's really nothing in the lived experience, for sure, at least people born in the 70s or the 80s, to give them any kind of pause. It's consonant with their lived experience. Now, look at our science fiction here in the West today, or in the UK. It's full of these dark visions about the baneful impact of technology. I am hard-pressed to think of one science fiction television series or one science fiction movie of recent vintage that isn't dystopian. I can only think of Arrival, which is a great movie. That's the only one that I can think of that is sort of a happier vision of what technology can do. The rest of them are all quite distinctly dystopian. I don't know if you're familiar with a show that I really quite like, one of the most popular sci-fi anthologies out there. It's available on Netflix. I highly recommend it. It's called Black Mirror. Who's seen Black Mirror? Right. So Black Mirror, if you haven't seen it, it's a great show. I'm not knocking it here. Every episode is predicated on these sort of near futures which are perverted, which are twisted, which are ruined profoundly by technology. This is wildly popular. Unsurprisingly, dystopian futures do not figure very much in Chinese science fiction. China's big blockbuster novel, a trilogy that we mostly know by the name of the first book, The Three-Body Problem. That trilogy of books by this science fiction author named Liu Cixin, it may have some kind of pessimistic themes in it. I mean, the Earth is going to be invaded by aliens who are 4 light years away. They can travel, 1/100th the speed of light. And so 400 years from now, the Earth is going to be overrun. And so it's about what the Earth does in preparation for it. And what does the Earth do? We get together to resist an alien invasion. It's a very happy story. In the various futures along the way, some of them have some terrible things that have happened, but mostly it's kind of amazing what technology has done. It's a bright vision. Liu Cixin has a movie, a short story that was made into a movie that's now playing in cinemas. It's called The Wandering Earth. In The Wandering Earth, in this future, the sun has swollen, it's going to endanger the Earth. So the world gets together. America is weirdly absent in this, but I don't know what happened to America, but the rest of the world anyway gets together to move the Earth into the orbit of another star. So, pretty cool stuff like that. I would say, by way of shorthand, that China, and I mean, think about how different this is, right? Well, in the 1960s, we had what was that? Star Trek, right? Star Trek had all sorts of wonderful visions. It sort of showed kind of us, our best selves projected into the future. So many wonderfully noble ideas that are in the universe of Star Trek. That's where China is. China is still in its Star Trek moment, where we have moved on into Black Mirror land. It's a very unfortunate thing. It's telling that I think some of the most revered figures of ours in technology, people like Elon Musk or Bill Gates even, or the late Stephen Hawking, who's not a technologist but a natural scientist, they're always worried about what general AI is going to do, about how it's going to bring ruin to humanity. Summoning the demon is what Elon Musk calls it. You don't hear conversations at that level in China. You will hear people worry about the impact that it's going to have on employment. You'll hear people worry about, there are conversations. They're mostly happening in obscure philosophy departments in the bowels of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. But there are some conversations about AI ethics, about safe AI. But it is not in the common parlance the way that it is here in the United States. And I suggest that it actually gives China a real buoyancy, a lift. China is still one of the few places on Earth where you have this unembarrassed embrace of the idea of tech-driven bright futures, of Futurama, flying cars and spiral towers and the whole works, which can be a very good thing. As I suggested, it can give you that kind of buoyancy, and I saw that all the time as I would see all the tech workers where I worked at Baidu, a big plant, with 40,000 people working there, and we'd all pour out of the subway all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to change the world for the better. And it's a really kind of an uplifting thing to be witness to. But I think it also has some downsides. There's other good things about it too. I mean, look, it's a great thing. It's kind of the land of nerd empowerment in a lot of good ways. And in a Chinese high school, the jock is not going to roll by in a Camaro, roll his window down and shout "nerd" at the straight-A STEM student. That just doesn't happen in China. In China, that straight-A STEM student, he's the one who gets the girl. It's great. I mean, it's the land of nerd empowerment. I'm all for it. And on the subject of parenting, for example, I mean, I've got kids, now in their teens, and for the last 5 years, all I ever find myself talking about with my American friends who have kids, or we're standing on the sidelines of the soccer game talking to the other parents, it's all about what? It's about how do you limit your kids' screen time? How do we limit screen time? They're all playing Fortnite now. I mean, we're all these conversations about that. You try having that conversation with a Chinese parent, and they'll be like, "What? I'm sorry, What did you say? Hang on, let me just. Very, very different world we're living in. I mean, I think there are downsides, though. I mean, I think it's going to starve, I think, a lot of they're just going to send too many of the best and brightest into the STEM fields and not into the humanities or in the social sciences. And I think that's a loss. It's a real thing, though. This technophilia is truly real. And there's a political dimension to it. I would assert that it has its roots in China's political culture and in the institutional expression of that culture really since the 1980s. China in the 1980s and especially in the 90s, and it still survived until quite recently, became, over these decades, the most thoroughly technocratic country in the world. What do I mean by that? It means that if you looked at the actual people who were holders of office, I mean, the studies that were done in the late 80s and the early 90s by Li Cheng and Lin White at Princeton University showed that within the Politburo, within the Standing Committee, within the Central Committee, rather, within the group of mayors of cities of over 1 million, within party secretaries of provinces or governors of provinces, you look at all of them, probably the average of ones who had a 4-year degree in engineering or in natural sciences was 80%. Who was the last American president who had an engineering degree? Carter, Jimmy Carter, absolutely. Before that, you got to go back to Herbert Hoover. When Jimmy Carter, nuclear engineer, worked on a submarine, but it was, later on in life, joined the Navy. Now, I should say that I am not an unadulterated fanboy of technocratic politics. I think it does have its good. I used to sort of be more enthusiastic about it. I would see how that lends one to be able to make, sort of long-term infrastructure investments of the kind that we've seen pay off really, really well in China. I think, there have been, though, many instances that you can point to in China where that kind of rigid, top-down, mechanistic thinking has been a significant disadvantage as well. But there is a distinct worldview that comes with this technocratic thinking. It's kind of a secular materialism. It's this kind of instrumental, very pragmatic view of how things ought to be done. It's pretty unsentimental. It doesn't maybe have as much of a human touch as I'd like to see. But on the good side, they don't spend a whole lot of time relitigating the Scopes monkey trial either. And so they've moved ahead in things like embryonic stem cell research in ways that we're unable to do in the United States. I should hasten to add, though, that the recent revelation that an American-trained researcher in Shenzhen by the name of He Jiankui, who, as many of you will know, he used CRISPR-Cas9, a very sophisticated gene editing technology, to edit the genes of embryos of twin girls, supposedly to render them immune to certain forms of HIV, common forms of HIV. That happened. I think that it was kind of one of those Tuskegee moments, though, in China. I'm really glad to see what happened. It looks like he was so roundly condemned within the scientific community and by party officialdom as well. That's an encouraging sign to me that maybe there are curbs on it. In any case, I hope it helps to think about the different sort of socio-cultural matrices in which technology is produced and in which technology is consumed here. I'm afraid that just deeper understanding alone, though, doesn't resolve any of our differences or diminish too many of the concerns that we have over the way things are actually going. What really worries me now is the fact that the path that Chinese and the Americans are on, even while we are pursuing so many of the same technologies, are diverging so quickly, so just unbelievably quickly. We really do face the possibility of a divided and necessarily more impoverished world, one where a digital iron curtain descends. This is a real danger. It ends up driving us apart in our own directions. I worry that this administration's open animosity, which will surely beget a kind of reciprocal animosity, already kind of has, as well as the very unwise policies that we're now floating, things like the visa restrictions on Chinese students, that this is just going to shoot us just squarely in the foot. It's going to push Beijing to redouble its own efforts at so-called indigenous innovation, to go it alone. Will foreclose the opportunity to work together on so many important things about standard setting, about ethics, about interoperability. It will foreclose all these possibilities. Technology, though, is really, it may be the most prominent and conspicuous of the difficulties that we face right now in our relationship with China. But as I hope I've made clear, there are other deeper underlying drivers of the tension, that the technology in some ways is just kind of a manifestation of it. Is it just this administration? Is it just the Trump administration? If it were, I would be a little, quick to suggest that, well, this is all kind of an effort to distract from the realities of the Mueller investigation, which will drop any day now. Maybe that's what it was, but it's not just this administration. This was already underway before this administration took office. I mean, that's the truth of it. There are more and more Democrats, big D Democrats in D.C., who advocated now for a tougher line on China. There are some people who would go so far as to call it a bipartisan consensus. I would not go so far. Many of them began doing that well ahead of the 2016 election. Some of the issues that they highlight may differ. They may care much more about human rights issues than they do about some of the economic competitive issues. But a growing number of China watchers, analysts, the academics, the journalists, the pundits, the policymakers who study China also now are beginning to see U.S. and Chinese interests as fundamentally incompatible, and this profoundly worries me. We saw this in November. There was a group of very prominent China watchers and China scholars who issued a 200-page report which called for something called, what was it called? Constructive vigilance, whatever the hell that means. And more worryingly, it laid out an alarming and I believe quite alarmist indictment of China's efforts to influence the United States. I've been involved for a long time in this debate about so-called influence operations. I side with the one courageous dissent that was written in that report, which is written by a former diplomat and a scholar named Susan Shirk, who worries about the conflation of legitimate and illegitimate activities on the part of China, none of which, she correctly points out, in any way meaningfully threaten our democratic institutions. She worries that this is going to tip into McCarthyism, into a Red Scare, into another yellow peril. And I think when we look at the number of Chinese scientists who are now under investigation for no good cause, this is something very real to worry about. At present, the most strident voices are mostly confined, thankfully, to D.C., but I fear that there's this darker view that's starting to spread outside of D.C. into the American public more generally. I think part of this is attributable to the surge of nativism that helped put Donald Trump in office and which his administration has continued to perpetuate. But even among those who ardently oppose this president, any honest appraisal has to conclude that this values gap between not just the governments, but even more worryingly, between the people of the United States and China has in recent years widened pretty appreciably. This isn't something that happened only in Xi Jinping's time either. This is something that also predates Xi Jinping's ascension to power around 6 years ago right now. There are many ways in which Beijing's behavior has already been trending toward the troubling, had already been really since 2009, 2010. And China's trajectory has been at least judged by the fonder wishes of some of of us who want to see China become more participatory and more deliberative and more open. It's gone in the wrong direction. That's very clear to many of us. So I can't claim to be surprised at all by the souring of relations that I'm seeing right now. But as a Chinese American, my fears are felt with a particular keenness. Ours, after all, is not a country known for reacting with calmness when it's possible to blame an outside racial group. Let's recall that after September 11th and again after San Bernardino, turban Sikhs were gunned down in the streets, other South Asians too, because they looked vaguely Muslim. So I'm not really sure. Vincent Chin in the 1980s in Detroit was beaten to death because of anti-Japanese sentiment. Chin is, as I don't need to tell you, a Chinese name. I actually have confidence, though, in the ability of the American body politic to respond to Chinese actions in a different way. I think that we have an immune system in this country that grows out of our openness, out of our pluralism, out of our rule of law, out of our tolerance, and it can deal with any number of problems that we face. Right now, with this mounting fear of Chinese influence operations, to me, it's like we're freaking out because we think we've been exposed to a carcinogen. There's no spot on our lung. There's no lump in our breast. There's nothing like that to suggest that we have cancer, but we think we might have been exposed to a carcinogen, and so we are now demanding a very strong course of radiation and chemo, which of course will weaken our own natural defense, which will really make the civic fabric of American society weak. And it is exactly that civic fabric which we need to have integrity in order to meet the sorts of challenges that I'm talking about. So in technology, can we find a way to compete in a healthy way that doesn't frame this competition with China as some sort of zero-sum game? Can we continue to actually, do what we had been doing for most of the last 40 years, to have this very positive, very, cooperative, collaborative, cross-pollinating relationship between these two technology ecosystems? I think so, but it's going to become a whole lot trickier. I think that right now, much of it is going to hinge on the fate of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, who is detained in Canada. She's a ticking time bomb. I mean, and if this goes wrong, all bets are off. Really, all bets are off. The Eurasia Group, which is a think tank headed by Ian Bremmer, they put out a really fascinating report recently that looked at the possibility of what they called innovation winter. We are in such this mad rush right now to decouple our tech ecosystem from China's, that one of the things that we're considering is weaning ourselves off of China's supply chain. Anyone who manufactures in China, and again, Bob, you know this too well, the entirety of the global advanced electronics supply chain sits in the Pearl River Delta, especially in the cities of Shenzhen and Dongguan. And that is a tremendous advantage to China in its ability to innovate. But that is not something that we can replicate anywhere else overnight. You can't just clone Huawei and put it, well, obviously, apparently we're not going to put it in Wisconsin, but I don't know, where it's going to, what would it require? It would require years of intensive efforts, a capital expenditure that's almost unimaginable, because it's not just the labor force, and it's not just the actual factories themselves. It's also a very sophisticated logistics ecosystem that we can't just replicate overnight. But if we do, say we try to do that, and we spend the next 10 years doing that, that money comes from somewhere, and it will crowd out R&D. It will push us into an innovation winter. That is not going to be an advantage. It may disadvantage China momentarily, but they will still have that supply chain intact sitting over there. What should we do instead? One idea that I have gravitated to is one that my very dear friend Sam Sachs has been advocating, and she says that this phrase first came from former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, and that is small yard, high fence. Small yard, high fence. There are things that we need to protect. There are pieces of American proprietary technology that can be effectively protected, but they need to be protected with a very, very high fence. But there are not many of them, and there are too many things that we're trying to enclose that simply we will never be able to enclose. AI is not something that we can put inside. That horse has long ago left the barn, and it ain't come back. That horse has had children all over the world, as it sired fillies the world over right now. It's something that we need to think very seriously about in defining our export control regime. And we need to realize that there are too many of things that we're putting in there right now that aren't. And 5G technologies, which by the way the United States does not develop. This is not a hill we should be willing to die on. I want to leave with this thought. I mean, let's not be naive. China does, and it will, as I said, continue to seek to advance its interests. It's going to push its own narratives. It's going to exert influence beyond its borders. That is what states do. And really, we Americans actually do it a whole lot better than anyone else, really. Better than the Chinese, that's for sure, especially when we have certain presidents in office. But I'm confident of the American ability to do that. I think as Americans, we need to answer China's rise, China's growing technology prowess, China's efforts to exert influence, not with anxiety or not with a desire to contain or to constrain or to thwart, but rather with a kind of buoyancy and a recaptured confidence of our own. I have confidence in the ability of our national defense, of our intelligence community, of especially our very good trained diplomatic corps. I have confidence in their ability to do their jobs, especially if they're left alone to do that without this fan flaming from the civilian population that's been mobilized against some notional threat from China. I have confidence in the abilities of our professional diplomatic corps to tackle these really difficult, thorny issues that now bedevil the U.S.-China relationship. And most of all, I have confidence in this natural immune system of an open, plural society to deal with threats to the integrity of our civic fabric. Right now, I fear our anxieties really are prompting an overreaction, one that may easily result in a new Red Scare, a new McCarthyism, a new Yellow Peril, marked by intolerance, by racial profiling, by all these things that will do so much more damage to our precious civic fabric than perceived Chinese threats could ever hope to. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
Thank you, Kaiser.
Thank you.
Wonderful lecture. Very inspiring and thought-provoking. And thank you, June and Bob, give us this great opportunity to have Kaiser here. I think we have a lot of questions. I have about 100 questions for you.
Okay.
But
I have
let's
time. I'm not going anywhere.
give our audience a voice first. So there is one question. I like this question. Let's start with something light.
Okay.
What was or is your favorite musician band from the Western world?
Well, I think I have to go with Rush.
Rush, okay.
Because they were the band that inspired me to play rock in the first place. I loved them from the time I was maybe 12 years old. I never stopped loving them. I've seen them in concert 30 times, and they were an inspiration for nerdy boys like me in junior high who didn't believe in conformity and wanted to make my own way in the world. Very good.
When I have some students and friends come to see you, that when I introduce you, I just told my friend, it's China's U2. Would you like that analogy or not? Or I should, you're China?
I mean, U2 is great and everything, but I think we were not as, we weren't political in the way that they are.
You weren't?
No, I wouldn't say we were political in that way.
But internationally?
No, that wasn't. That wasn't political. That was just a tune we liked and heard a lot during the spring of 1989.
That's right. Yeah. Next question is about technology. Are there areas of technology that China will develop that will benefit American in future? For example, medicines or medical technology.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that these are areas Look, China has a kind of a demographic urgency to, I mean, I think a lot of smart VC money right now is looking at healthcare in China just because of the demographic structure. That we have a very, very fast aging, this is almost an unprecedented surge in the proportion of people who are going to be, older and will need a lot of healthcare. This is, there's no question that's going to be an area. And again, you have a slightly more permissive environment for, I mean, look, there are some pharmaceutical companies who treat China sort of as a playground, and I think that's very problematic. But I think somebody once joked to me, I mean, if you're here in the United States, you probably, especially in the academia, you know, it's true, that life sciences departments at American universities exist to transfer knowledge from old Jewish men to young Chinese women. And, and that is what has happened. And many of these young Chinese women, after cutting their teeth in some of the best biotech companies in the United States, have gone on to start amazing companies in China. China is extremely advanced in things like genomics. Yeah.
Very good, thank you. Well, next question about what scares Marco Rubio, the Made in China 2025. And, I don't, personally, I don't think that is Marco Rubio, senator, have a lot of credibility after this German dam incident. But these questions come from what they heard from the Chinese government. Former Finance Minister Lou Jiwei recently said that he considers Made in China 2025 a huge waste of taxpayers' money, and it was a mistake for the state to pick companies and technologies to back. And that also, just add my own footnote, that there is argument that the Belt and Road Initiative actually is a big blunder as well.
Right.
And what do you think?
So it's a very strange situation we find ourselves in. Either we believe that these sorts of top-down approaches, that big government-led initiatives don't work, and that's why we don't do them. They're bound to, as you suggested, to fail. If we believe that, what are we so worked up about? Let them fail then, right? If you want, I mean, that's fine. That's a perfectly good strategy. And if we believe they do work, why the hell aren't we doing them? I mean, because it's ideological. If we believe so much in the invisible hand, we believe them. But that runs completely contrary to the reality of the United States. We have this mythology about the Silicon Valley bootstrappers, but look at the reality of how Silicon Valley got started. It was defense money. Where did the internet get developed? Anyone know? DARPA. And what was it built for? So that we would have networks that would survive a nuclear war. There's, the money that seeded Silicon Valley came from what Eisenhower rightly called the military-industrial complex.
That's right.
And the other thing is, I should maybe add, I think a good way of understanding programs like Made in China 2025, or I think that this is something that people don't really get. The China AI plan, for example. These do not, there's some dumb money thrown around, yes, but these do not set out very, very specific blueprints. These are not blueprints, they're actually thin documents. They identify areas where they send very clear signals to officialdom all over the country that these are KPIs against which your performance will be measured. If you if you show me that you've done work toward this goal, you're going to advance. And that's how it works. And so it's like a mafia boss. Sits his lieutenants down and says, hey, I got a birthday coming up, and maybe you could surprise me with something I like. Right? That's sort of how it works.
Thanks a lot.
I'm stealing that routine from this guy named Matt Sheehan, who was a friend of mine who wrote that. Well,
all right. Next question about China's soft power. In what way are PRC People's Republic of China influence attempts in areas like the internet, US think tanks, and education, and to which degree it was actually exaggerated. Well, Russians buying ads on social media and facing scam of the DNC are not.
Yeah, this is a great question. So these are just absolutely different creatures, what the Russians have done and what China supposedly is trying to do. The thing I would say about China is, first of all, they're intended to be defensive. What China wants to do is it wants to deflect or dilute negative narratives about China. That's what it seeks to do. And while that may be objectionable, because it does dilute or deflect, and these aren't good things, it is not sinister to the extent that pulling the epistemological rug out from under the entirety of American Western society is, which is what Russia wants to do. It wants to basically make us believe nothing so we can believe anything, to set us against each other by using hot button issues like abortion, like race, like gay rights. That's what Russia, all evidence has set out to do. And the big difference is that Russia has been successful in doing largely that, whereas China is absolutely inept at what it tries to do. It is so ham-fisted and clumsy, and its efforts can be seen a mile away. It's like, oh, here comes the stupid Chinese propaganda organ again. There's a really horrifying and yet comical tableau to which reporters who were invited to see one of these concentration camps in Xinjiang were exposed. They came, China built these Potemkin village-style re-education camps in Xinjiang and invited first, human rights community, the Red Cross, to come see them. No one took the bait. Nobody wanted to do that. But a bunch of journalists decided, yeah, we'll go. We'll see what this is about. And so they walked by, and there's the Uyghurs colorfully dressed in their native costumes, and they're singing their songs. And, okay, that's kind of one level of horrifying. Then there was another room where there were the young Uyghurs all sitting there and singing rhythmically. I shit you not. They sang, "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands," in English. I mean, it's like, okay. This underscores my point. Clumsy, ineffective, own goals. They're only capable of hurting themselves. Chinese soft power is basically non-existent. Okay, let's face it. Because China is obsessed with trying to build soft power. The first rule of soft power is don't talk about soft power. China does not understand that soft power seeps in from the periphery. That is the thing that bubbles up from the grassroots. That's the stuff that it has to be when you allow people to be a little more transgressive, when you allow people to be a little more experimental, that's not China's MO. China and soft power, it's like, I compared it to this one. It's like a Chinese guy who wants to date. And, because Joseph Nye at Harvard, he's the guy who coined this term soft power. And soft power is the power of attraction, not of payment or coercion. So I think about attraction, literally, and say so if he wanted to know what women want, he need only look at, classified ads. They don't have those anymore, but, maybe go on some dating site. And what do they want? They want a guy who's self-confident and humorous. So with China, with the self-confidence thing, so China's doing better now. I mean, it's dressing a little better. It's hitting the gym. It's trying to stop smoking. These are all parables. These are all metaphors. You're getting them, right? Smoking, pollution, right? Hitting the... Right? But it has this terrible inability to settle into that comfortable, hey. Instead, it goes from this retiring and shy, kind of talking into my chest and kind of to this bullying swagger and nothing in between. It does these pendular swings. It just needs to learn to, yeah, that's right.
I know.
I can give him pointers, man.
I cannot agree with you more that, one time I talked to a Chinese government official that I think that I really, really want to hear some self-deprecating jokes from the government officials.
Right, and you won't, yeah. Yeah, someday somebody's going to go put the PR back in the PRC. Right.
Well, next question is about China's image. And both you and I travel to China quite frequently. I'm not sure you bring your 3M masks with you when you travel to Beijing.
Yeah.
I do, but I never use it because I see nobody use it in Beijing. I put it on for 2 hours and feel I'm an idiot in Beijing. I just took it off. But the question here is, will China save its reputation from pollution?
Yeah, so there's been a downtick recently. I mean, things have gotten worse just very recently, but that's because of, well, frankly, it's because of the trade war, it's because of the softening economy, and because they need to turn some of these polluting factories back on just to drive, I mean, to get producer price index back, to get keep people working. That's an unfortunate thing, but the reality is pollution in Beijing has declined appreciably from 2013 to 2018. This winter was bad. There's no question, but there's externalities that explain that.
Great. So,
Now this is one thing that they are taking quite seriously, and I mean, my hat's off to them for that.
I agree. And next question about what technology. Again, you are a technology journalist, and you're pretty familiar with all these new innovative companies, bubbling up in China everywhere. What examples of joint tech development of U.S. and China you can share with us?
Of joint U.S.-China development.
Yes.
Sure. There's you guys have seen that there's now this mobile phone screen that's foldable. You can bend that. That was developed by a guy who is a Stanford graduate who has joint teams in the United States and in China. A lot of them. I mean, the company I work for, Baidu, did a lot of its AI development using people hired locally in the United States, in the Silicon Valley. Alibaba, Tencent, they all have R&D facilities now in the United States. It's something that I really worry about, because this is one of the things that may become a victim of current trade tensions. But this is extreme. I mean, there are other reasons why they have R&D centers here. One of them is if you have really good engineers and you send them to the United States, well, first of all, it's a reward for them, but also it's harder for them to be spied on by our competitors.
That's right. Next question about technology savvy. Do mature Chinese keep up with technology?
I'm sorry?
Mature Chinese. I think the questioner want to ask about the elders. Do elders are technology savvy? They know how to use WeChat?
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty good. I mean, it's pretty intuitive stuff. It's not particularly hard. I mean, I think, yeah, there's plenty of people. I know, like, my in-laws are inundating me with WeChat messages all the time, and they're along in years. I think there are plenty of older people now who know how to so their children teach them. In fact, I mean, I'm sure all of the younger Chinese people here tonight have had this experience of going home for Chunjie and spending an hour teaching your mom how to use this new app, right? It's something that we all have done, right?
And you briefly mentioned that the social credit system is similar to our social security number, but it's vastly not. And so next question is about what do you see the social credit system? What influence does internet brings to the social credit system?
Okay, so the social credit system exists mainly as a plan right now. There are pilot programs that have rolled out in a few dozen cities. Many of them have already been shut down, but there is no national unified social credit system. That does not exist. There are companies, especially Tencent, that have rolled out something that they also call social credit. They call Sesame Credit in the case of Tencent, which is the most popular one. But that has so much more in common with a loyalty program like with my Aviator Advantage Red Card for American Airlines than anything else. I mean, you get perks when you keep your credit score at a particular level. You know, it may be kind of warped that they will dock you. I mean, my phone tells me, I mean, I've been flying a lot recently and playing stupid games on my phone, but it chided me the other day that said, you know, my screen time was this much, and that percentage of it was on productivity, that percentage of it was on games. So in China, that time that I spent playing some dumb game just because my son beat my high score and I can't go home in humiliation, that would dock me. That would, you know, lower my score. So it is encouraging, but that is not coming from the government. What the only thing that the government has done so far with this social credit system is it's worked with the courts to create a system of blacklists for people who are in arrears, like deadbeat dads, people who have been fined by law courts and have not paid their penalties, people who. That's so far, and they're prevented from buying high-speed rail tickets. They're prevented from checking into 4-star and 5-star hotels. They're prevented from flying.
Yes, and that makes sense.
I don't know. I mean, of course, anyone raised in the West with Western values is going to find something slightly objectionable about it. But it's amazing when you look at what, I mean, as a very good friend of mine named Manya Ketsu, who has this great blog called What's on Weibo, she looked at all the conversations that were happening in English about the social credit system and did a word cloud around it, and all the words were Black Mirror and Orwell and, you know, all this stuff. And then you look at you compare that to the word cloud of Chinese conversations about it, and it's like discount, it's like savings, it's like bonus. It's really absolutely separate conversations.